The fluorescent lights of the Sterling Vane skyscraper hummed with a cold, mechanical indifference that matched the temperament of the men who walked its halls. Alara sat at her workstation, a sleek slab of mahogany that served as both her fortress and her cage, methodically organizing the chaotic schedule of Marcus Thorne, the senior VP of acquisitions. To the passing eye, she was a fixture of the lobby, efficient, silent, and entirely replaceable. Her hands moved with a practiced grace, filing documents that held the weight of millions, while her ears remained tuned to the toxic whispers of the executive suite. She had been in this seat for 2 years, enduring the invisible status of a subordinate while the blood of the company's founder, Arthur Sterling, pulsed through her veins. It was a Tuesday morning when the pressure finally began to fracture the carefully maintained facade of the firm. Marcus Thorne stepped out of the elevator, his tailored suit worth more than most people's annual salary, and tossed a heavy leather-bound folder onto Alara's desk without a word of greeting. The impact sent a stray pen rolling across the floor, but Alara didn't flinch. She simply looked up with a neutral expression that masked a sharp, analytical mind. Thorne's eyes didn't even meet hers as he barked an order about a last-minute board meeting regarding the merger with the Holloway Group. To him, she was a tool, a biological extension of the office software designed to facilitate his rise to the top of the food chain. The catalyst for the day's tension was a missing signature on the Holloway merger, a document that Arthur Sterling had supposedly authorized before his sudden, health-related withdrawal from public life. Thorne was frantic, his bravado masking a deep-seated fear that his illegal shortcuts were about to be exposed by the internal audit team. He leaned over Alara's desk, his shadow looming over her, and hissed that if the filing wasn't found, it would be her head on the chopping block. He didn't realize that Alara had purposely moved the file to a secure digital vault months ago, watching as he grew increasingly reckless in his attempts to bypass company protocol. She offered a polite, apologetic smile, the kind that disarms the arrogant, and promised to look into it, while noting the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. By noon, the office was a pressure cooker of ambition and disrespect. During a brief lunch break, Alara sat in the communal break room, nursing a lukewarm coffee while 2 junior executives discussed her as if she were a piece of furniture. They joked about her limited horizons and speculated on how long someone could be satisfied with just answering phones before their soul withered away. Alara listened to their laughter, her eyes fixed on the city skyline through the glass, realizing that these were the men her father had entrusted with his legacy. The lack of character was not just a personal flaw. It was a systemic rot that threatened the very foundation of the Sterling Empire, and her role as the invisible observer was nearing its inevitable end. The afternoon brought a summons to the main boardroom, not as a participant, but as a note-taker. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static of impending conflict. The Holloway representatives were impatient, demanding proof of the CEO's personal approval, which Thorne claimed was in transit. Alara sat in the corner, her laptop open, her fingers flying across the keys as she recorded every lie, every deflection, and every unethical promise made by the men at the table. She saw the way they looked past her, their gazes sliding over her as if she were a ghost, never imagining that the person recording their downfall was the very person who owned the chair they sat in. Thorne's frustration finally boiled over when the Holloway CEO, a sharp-tongued woman named Diane, asked a technical question about the dividend distribution. Thorne stumbled, his knowledge of the actual mechanics of the company proving to be superficial at best. He turned toward Alara, not for help, but to deflect blame, loudly snapping that his secretary must have misfiled the supplementary data. The room went silent as he berated her in front of the most powerful people in the industry, calling her incompetence a burden to the firm's efficiency. Alara felt the sting of the insult, but beneath it she felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The test was over, and Thorne had failed spectacularly. That evening, Alara remained at her desk long after the executives had retreated to their penthouses and bars. She pulled a small, encrypted key from her necklace, a gift from her father, and inserted it into her terminal. The screen flickered, bypassing the standard employee interface and opening a master portal that only 2 people in the world had access to. She watched the security footage of Thorne entering her office earlier that day, caught in the act of trying to break into her private drawer to find the missing merger papers. His desperation was a vivid portrait of a man who had lost his way, and Alara knew that by tomorrow morning, the secretary would have to disappear to make room for the heir. She picked up her phone and made a single call to her father's private legal counsel, Julian Vane. His voice was weary but sharpened instantly when he realized who was on the line. "It's time, Julian," she said, her voice devoid of its usual submissive lilt. replaced by a command that echoed the authority of 3 generations of Sterlings. She told him to prepare the emergency board activation and to ensure the security team was briefed on a high-level transition. As she hung up, she looked at the nameplate on her desk that simply read, Alara S. Administrative Assistant. She didn't throw it away. She placed it in her bag as a reminder of the 2 years she spent seeing the world from the bottom up, a perspective she would never allow herself to forget. The sun rose over Manhattan with a harsh, glaring light that seemed to strip away the city's pretenses. Inside Sterling Vane, the atmosphere was electric, with the news of an unscheduled mandatory board meeting at 9 a.m. Marcus Thorne was already in the building, pacing his office and barking into his cell phone, trying to coordinate a story with his accomplices about the missing Holloway documents. He had spent the night spiraling into a paranoid frenzy, convinced that someone was sabotaging his career, never once suspecting the woman who had brought him his black coffee every morning for the past 700 days. He felt the walls closing in, but his arrogance still provided a shield of delusion. He believed his status made him untouchable. Alara arrived at the office exactly 5 minutes late, a calculated breach of her usual punctuality. She wasn't wearing her usual muted gray cardigan or the sensible flats that made her blend into the shadows. Instead, she wore a sharp, charcoal-toned suit that fit her like armor, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional knot that highlighted the severity of her features. As she walked through the lobby, the security guards, who usually gave her a cursory nod, found themselves standing a little straighter, sensing a shift in her gravity that they couldn't quite explain. She didn't go to her desk. She walked straight toward the executive elevators, the ones reserved for the C-suite and the board of directors. In the hallway, she encountered Sarah, another assistant who had often joined in the subtle mockery of Alara's dead-end position. Sarah stopped her, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and misplaced concern, whispering that Thorne was in a murderous mood and that Alara should get to her desk before he saw her. Alara paused, looking at the woman who had been her peer for years, and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that was both kind and devastatingly final. "Thank you, Sarah," Alara said, her voice resonant and calm. "But I think Mr. Thorne has much bigger problems to worry about this morning than my desk being empty." She stepped into the private elevator, leaving Sarah staring at the closing doors in stunned silence. Inside the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The directors, men and women who had grown wealthy on the back of Arthur Sterling's vision, were whispering in hushed tones about the unauthorized summons. Julian Vane, the firm's elder statesman and legal titan, stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone. When Thorne burst into the room, demanding to know why a meeting was called without his approval, Julian didn't even look up from his papers. Thorne's face was flushed, his tie slightly askew, the image of a man losing control of his kingdom. He began a tirade about protocol and the Holloway merger, oblivious to the fact that the trap had already been set and the doors were metaphorically locked. Alara stood in the antechamber, listening to the muffled sounds of Thorne's shouting through the heavy oak doors. She felt no joy in the coming confrontation, only a profound sense of duty to the legacy her father had built. She remembered the nights her father spent teaching her about the invisible people, the janitors, the clerks, the drivers, and how they were the true pulse of any organization. Her 2 years as a secretary hadn't been a trial of endurance, but a masterclass in human nature. She had seen how power corrupted the weak, and how quickly respect vanished when it wasn't backed by fear or utility. The conflict in the room was not just about a merger. It was a battle for the soul of the company. Thorne was in the middle of a frantic explanation regarding the clerical errors of his secretary when the doors finally opened. Alara didn't rush in. She entered with a measured, rhythmic pace that commanded the air in the room. The murmurs died down instantly. The directors looked at her with a mix of recognition and utter bewilderment. They knew her face. She was the girl who brought the water, the one who printed the slides, but they didn't recognize the woman standing before them. Thorne stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open as he processed the sight of his subordinate, walking to the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat reserved for the Sterling family. "You're in the wrong room, Alara," Thorne sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bite, betraying a sudden cold spike of adrenaline. He reached out as if to grab her arm and usher her out, but Julian Vane stepped forward with a sharp, "Don't touch her, Marcus." The room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Julian cleared his throat and addressed the board, his voice booming with a formality that signaled the end of an era. He announced that per the bylaws of the Sterling Vane Trust, and in light of Arthur Sterling's permanent retirement, the controlling interest and the position of chairperson were now being formally assumed by his sole heir, Alara Sterling Vane. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Thorne's heavy breathing. He looked from Julian to Alara, his brain struggling to bridge the gap between the secretary he had insulted yesterday and the heir who now held his entire future in her hands. The path of his ambition had collided head-on with a reality he never bothered to consider. Alara didn't look away from him. She met his gaze with a steady, unblinking intensity that made him feel smaller than he had ever made her feel. The conflict was no longer a shadow play in the hallways. It was a public execution of his authority, and the blade was already falling. The break didn't happen with a shout, but with the soft click of a laptop opening. Alara signaled to the IT director, who was standing by the door, and the large monitors in the boardroom flickered to life. On the screens appeared a comprehensive log of every unauthorized transaction, every deleted email, and every private message Marcus Thorne had sent using the company's secure servers over the last 18 months. It was a digital autopsy of a career built on deceit. The directors watched in horrified silence as the evidence of Thorne's embezzlement and his plan to sell off Sterling Vane assets to the Holloway Group for a personal kickback were laid bare in high definition. Thorne's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into the nearest chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He tried to speak, to offer one last lie, but the words died in his throat as Alara began to speak. Her voice was cold, precise, and lacked any hint of the polite secretary persona she had inhabited. She detailed the exact moment he had decided to betray her father's trust, citing specific dates and conversations he thought were private. She described the way he treated the staff, the way he inflated his own importance while hollowed out the company's value, and how he had mistaken her silence for ignorance. "You called me a burden to the firm's efficiency yesterday, Marcus," Alara said, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "But while you were busy trying to hide your tracks, I was the one keeping this company running from the desk you thought was beneath you. I didn't just file your papers. I corrected your errors before they reached the board. I didn't just schedule your meetings. I sat in them and learned exactly which of your allies were willing to sell us out for a profit." She turned her gaze toward two other directors at the table, who immediately looked down at their hands, their faces pale with the realization that their complicity was also on the screen. The break was total. The hierarchy that Thorne had spent a decade climbing vanished in a matter of minutes. He was no longer the senior VP. He was a liability being excised like a tumor. Alara authorized the immediate termination of his contract, effective 2 minutes ago, and informed him that the firm's legal team would be filing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. The other directors, sensing the shift in power, quickly began to distance themselves from Thorne, their previous loyalty dissolving like salt in rain. They were terrified, not of Thorne's downfall, but of Alara's ascent and what else she might know about their own minor indiscretions. Outside the boardroom, word began to spread through the office like wildfire. The secretary was the owner. The quiet girl was the boss. The atmosphere in the open-plan office shifted from a hum of productivity to a stunned, uneasy quiet. Employees peered through the glass walls of the executive wing, watching as security guards were summoned to the boardroom. The reality of the situation began to sink in. The woman they had ignored, joked about, or simply walked past without a second thought was now the person who signed their paychecks and decided their fates. The social fabric of the office, built on a rigid and often cruel hierarchy, was being torn apart. Inside the room, Thorne finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, broken sound. He pleaded for a private conversation, citing his years of service and his mentorship of the staff. Alara didn't even acknowledge the request. She watched as security entered the room and placed a firm hand on Thorne's shoulder. The image of the powerful executive being escorted out like a common trespasser was a visual representation of the company's new reality. He looked back at Alara one last time, his eyes filled with a desperate, burning resentment, but she had already turned her attention to the next item on the agenda, treating him with the same invisibility he had once forced upon her. The reckoning extended beyond Thorne. Alara addressed the remaining board members, her tone shifting from an accuser to a leader. She informed them that the merger with Holloway was being canceled immediately and that an independent audit of every department would begin at noon. She made it clear that the culture of willful blindness was over. Those who had helped Thorne or turned a blind eye to his corruption were given a choice: resign now with a modest severance and a non-disclosure agreement, or face the full scrutiny of the audit and the potential legal consequences that would follow. The break was not just a person, but a way of doing business that had become toxic. As the meeting adjourned, Alara stood alone in the boardroom for a moment, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the chaos had been. She felt the weight of the crown she had finally put on, and it was heavier than she had imagined. Her 2 years of hiding were over, but the real work was just beginning. She looked at the chair she now occupied, realizing that while she had successfully destroyed the old order, she now had the monumental task of building something better from the ruins. The secretary was dead, the heir was alive, and the company was finally, truly, hers. The aftermath of the boardroom coup, as it came to be known in the financial rags, was a tidal wave of litigation and restructuring. Marcus Thorne didn't go quietly. Within 48 hours, he had hired a high-priced fixer to leak stories to the press, claiming that Alara was an unstable heiress who had spied on her employees and was unfit for leadership. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly, the Sterling Vane building was surrounded by reporters and cameras. Alara, however, had anticipated this. She didn't hide in a limousine or release a defensive statement. She continued to walk through the main lobby every morning, her presence a silent, immovable rebuttal to Thorne's desperate smears. The internal consequences were even more profound. Half of the senior management team resigned within the first week, fearing the Alara audit. The office felt hollowed out, a skeleton of its former self, as the people who had built their careers on proximity to Thorne's power vanished. For the remaining employees, the atmosphere was one of extreme anxiety. They didn't know if they were next, or if the secretary they once knew held grudges for every forgotten coffee or missed hello. Alara sensed this tension and began to hold small, department-level meetings, not in the boardroom, but in the break rooms and open spaces where the real work happened. During one such meeting with the IT and logistics teams, she noticed the shift in how people spoke to her. There was a forced, terrified politeness that she found more exhausting than the previous dismissiveness. She stood at the head of a communal table and spoke plainly. "I am the same person who sat at that desk for 2 years. I know who works late. I know who takes credit for other people's ideas. And I know who actually keeps this company afloat. If you did your job with integrity when you thought I was just a secretary, you have nothing to fear. If you didn't, my name on the building won't save you." It was a hard truth that provided a grim sort of comfort to the honest workers. Legal consequences for Thorne and his inner circle arrived with the force of a sledgehammer. The documents Alara had gathered were so meticulous that the district attorney's office took an interest in the case, investigating not just corporate fraud, but tax evasion and money laundering. Thorne's assets were frozen, and the man who once bragged about his vintage wine collection was now facing the very real possibility of a prison sentence. Alara watched the news from her new office, which she had moved from the penthouse down to a mid-level floor to be closer to the operations, feeling a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. The Holloway Group, seeing the chaos, attempted a hostile takeover, believing the company was vulnerable during the transition. They didn't realize that Alara had used her secretary years to study their own vulnerabilities. She launched a counteroffensive that wasn't just defensive, but predatory. She leaked proof of Holloway's own precarious debt-to-equity ratio, information she had gathered while filing Thorne's secret correspondence, effectively tanking their stock and forcing them to retreat. It was a move that earned her the immediate, if begrudging, respect of the global financial market. The girl was a shark, and she had been swimming in their tank for years without them noticing. Socially, the consequences were a bitter pill. Alara found that she could no longer have peers. The people she once considered friends among the administrative staff now treated her like a distant deity or a dangerous predator. The isolation of power was immediate and absolute. She realized that by choosing to observe from the bottom, she had sacrificed her ability to ever truly belong there again. She was no longer Alara. She was the heir, a symbol of wealth and authority that created a permanent barrier between her and the world she had grown to understand. It was a heavy price to pay for the truth, and there were nights she sat in her silent apartment, mourning the simplicity of her former life. Her father, Arthur, finally made a public appearance alongside her to signal the official passing of the torch. He was frail, but his eyes were sharp with pride as he watched his daughter handle the board with a steeliness he had never possessed. He told her that he had placed her at that desk not to punish her, but to protect her from becoming like the men in the boardroom. He wanted her to see the ugly side of power before she was consumed by it. Alara realized then that her choice to be a secretary was actually her father's final, most important lesson, that the view from the bottom is the only way to see the cracks in the foundation. As the month closed, the office began to stabilize. New, younger, and more diverse managers were brought in to replace the old guard. The culture of just a secretary was replaced by a rigid policy of mutual respect, enforced by a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to be disrespected. The company was smaller, leaner, and more honest, but the scars of the break remained. Thorne was awaiting trial, the board was purged, and Alara stood at the window of her office, looking down at the street level. She saw a young woman walking into the building with a briefcase and a nervous smile, starting her first day as an assistant, and Alara promised herself that this girl would never be invisible in her house. The final resolution of the Sterling Vane saga didn't conclude in a courtroom or a gala, but in a quiet, empty office on a Sunday evening. The lawsuits had been settled, mostly in Alara's favor, and Marcus Thorne had accepted a plea deal that would see him serve 5 years in a minimum security facility, his reputation utterly destroyed. The Holloway Group had been absorbed by a competitor, and Sterling Vane's stock was higher than it had been in a decade. But for Alara, the real resolution was internal. She had successfully navigated the transition from the Invisible Girl to the Iron Lady, but she had to decide what kind of leader she would be for the next 40 years. She walked through the silent floors of the building, stopping at her old desk. It was now occupied by a new assistant, a young man named David. His desk was organized, but it lacked the hidden layers of surveillance and strategy hers once had. She touched the mahogany surface, remembering the countless times she had swallowed an insult or bit her tongue while Thorne hovered over her. She realized that the anger she had carried for 2 years was finally gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. She wasn't just there to protect a fortune. She was there to redefine what value meant in a corporate world that only measured it in dollars. Alara implemented a radical new structure for the company, the Sterling Protocol. It mandated that every executive, regardless of their background, had to spend 1 month every 2 years working in a support role, answering phones, working the warehouse, or handling customer service. There was pushback, of course, from the remaining elite, but Alara's authority was now absolute. She told them that if they weren't willing to see the company from the eyes of those who built it, they didn't deserve a seat at the table where the profits were divided. It was her way of ensuring that no one else in her company would ever be just anything. She also reached out to Sarah, the assistant who had once mocked her. Instead of firing her, Alara promoted her to a role in human resources, specifically tasked with oversight of workplace culture and grievance reporting. It was a move that stunned the office, but Alara knew that Sarah, having been part of the old system, knew exactly where the bodies were buried and how the gossip mills worked. It was an act of pragmatic mercy that turned a potential enemy into a loyal ally. Alara wasn't interested in a reign of terror. She wanted a reign of transparency, and that required people who understood the shadows. On the anniversary of her ascension, Alara hosted a town hall meeting for the entire staff. There were no VIP sections, no reserved seating for the board. She stood on a small platform in the lobby, the same lobby where she had been invisible for 24 months. She didn't talk about quarterly earnings or market share. She talked about the janitor who had taught her how to bypass the old security locks, and the courier who had told her about his daughter's graduation. She spoke about the worth of a person being independent of their position, and she promised that as long as she was in charge, the person at the desk would always be as important as the person in the office. The resolution with her father was more bittersweet. Arthur Sterling passed away peacefully a few months later, knowing his legacy was in hands that were both stronger and kinder than his own. At his funeral, Alara didn't sit with the politicians or the titans of industry. She sat in the middle of the pews, surrounded by the office staff, the drivers, and the long-term employees who had actually known the man behind the myth. She realized that she had achieved the one thing her father always wanted. She had become a Sterling without losing her Alara. The 2 years of silence had given her a voice that no one could ever ignore again. The company's headquarters were eventually moved to a more open, collaborative space in Brooklyn, leaving the ivory tower of the skyscraper behind. The move was symbolic of the new era, grounded, connected, and real. Marcus Thorne's name became a cautionary tale whispered in business schools, a ghost of an era that valued ego over ethics. Alara rarely thought of him anymore. He was a relic of a past she had successfully dismantled. She was too busy looking toward a future where the hierarchy wasn't a pyramid to be climbed, but a circle to be maintained. As the sun set on a Friday evening, Alara left her office and walked toward the elevator. She passed the reception desk and stopped to chat with the evening guard, asking about his family by name. She wasn't doing it because it was good leadership, but because she genuinely cared. The secretary in her was still very much alive. As she stepped out into the crisp New York air, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. She had been the real heir all along, not because of her bloodline, but because she was the only one who had been willing to start at the bottom to see the truth. The world saw a powerful CEO, but Alara knew the truth. She was a woman who finally knew exactly what she was worth.